Dispense with.
Without objection, the senator from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first, I rise in support of S-679, a bipartisan effort that will streamline presidential appointments and reduce the number of Senate confirmations for certain types of positions, and urge my colleagues to support this bill. First, I want to praise my colleague and friend, Senator Alexander, who has been a leading, if not the leading force in this area. And we have worked together well in a bipartisan way to try to come up with a proposal that meets the agreement of the Chamber. He's done a great job, and it's been a pleasure, I would say, to my friend from Tennessee to work with him, as it always is. I also want to thank, of course, Senator Reid, who has encouraged us to get involved in this process and has been right there with us all the way, as well as Republican leader McConnell, who, again, has, from the beginning, been on our side and agreed that this is a worthwhile thing to do. And so we formed a bipartisan working group at Senator Reid and Senator McConnell's behest to try and figure out how to reduce the number of presidential appointments that require Senate confirmation and to create new procedures to confirm the pace of confirmation for executive branch nominees as part of an overall reform of the Senate rules. Senators Alexander, Lieberman, Collins, and I, in conjunction with the leaders, worked closely to develop this bill and the accompanying resolution, which we'll turn to immediately after the bill, to improve how the Senate deals with executive nominations. Throughout this entire process, we've partnered with folks from both sides of the aisle, and many have significantly contributed to this process. But this package is an essential piece of the bipartisan rules reform we began at the start of Congress. And Senators Lieberman and Collins have had a lot of experience in this regard. They have tried it before, and their advice to us has been invaluable as well. Now, the Senate was designed to be a thoughtful and deliberative body, but the confirmation process is often slowed to a near standstill. This legislation will clear some of the more non-controversial positions so the Senate can focus on its constitutional advise and consent power as it was intended to confirm the most important positions. The bill is not intended to take away or diminish the Senate's advise and consent power. The power will remain and still be used for the confirmation of senior policy-making appointments. The purpose of this legislation is to help the Senate function better and more efficiently. Rather than spending time in committee and on the floor confirming nominees who have part-time appointments, non-policy-making responsibilities, or who directly report to Senate-confirmable individuals, we can alleviate ourselves of this burden and make these individuals non-confirmable. With that said, I recognize that some of our chairmen would like to see certain positions remain confirmable. We are continuing to work with them on their concerns, and we want to be flexible. And we will be working with some of those senators from both sides of the aisle who would voice some objections and think the list is too large. However, we also want to avoid the hollowing out of this bill so that it no longer represents real reform. Over the past few decades, hundreds of these positions have been created, which have contributed to a clogging of the Senate and a delay in getting good mid-level candidates in place to help the government function effectively. The bill will eliminate from Senate confirmation 200 executive nomination positions. It covers several categories of positions, including legislative and public affairs positions, information technology administrators, internal management and administrative positions, and deputies or non-policy related assistant secretaries who report to individuals who are Senate confirmable. Additionally, we've removed thousands of positions from the Public Health Service Officer Corps and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Officer Corps from the confirmation process. These positions are non-controversial, and their removal will further prevent the possibility of gridlock. Removing these positions from the Senate confirmation process will allow a new administration to be set up with more efficiency and speed, thus making government work better for the people. The public should not be harmed because we're not able to get qualified people confirmed in a timely manner. The bill will also create a working group that will provide recommendations to the President and the Senate to further improve the confirmation process. The group will focus on offering guidance on the paperwork process for nominees through examining the creation of a single searchable electronic smart form, and will also conduct a review of the current background investigation requirements. In conclusion, this will help make the confirmation process less tedious for nominees by preventing them from having to submit the same information in several different forms to several entities. The bill was successfully passed by the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, and SRES 116, which will return to immediately after this bill, was marked up in the Rules Committee unanimously. We're confident that this bill, in conjunction with the resolution, will eliminate many of the delays in the current confirmation process. In conclusion, these delays are very detrimental to the efficient operation of government and to the efforts to recruit the most qualified people to these federal jobs. The public deserves for us to focus our deliberation on confirming the most important positions and not to hold up those generally non-controversial positions which more closely resemble appointments that are currently made without Senate approval. I yield the floor, and I know my colleague, Senator Alexander, will speak next.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee is recognized.
I want to congratulate Senator Schumer for his diligent work on this effort to help the Senate do a better job with its responsibilities of advise and consent. As the chairman of the Rules Committee, he and I have been working together at the direction of Senator Reid and Senator McConnell to come up with a consensus about how to do this. And our colleagues, all 100, have agreed that we could move on to the bill and debate any relevant amendment, which hasn't happened very often around here and is exactly the way the Senate ought to work. So I thank Senator Schumer for taking on this difficult task. It's not a glamorous task, but it's one that hopefully will make the Senate more effective. And if we're more effective, we can do a better job of dealing with the debt, of helping to make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs, of coming up with an energy policy that helps us find more American energy and use less, and that gains respect from the American people who have given us the privilege of serving here. I start this discussion with our Constitution, which the late Senator Byrd used to suggest we should carry with us all around. Perhaps the most celebrated constitutional duty of the United States Senate is our responsibility to advise and consent. It's in Section 2, Article 2 of the Constitution. It talks about the President there, but it says he shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties and to do other things, to appoint a number of people. But it also says the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. So this discussion, Mr. President, is about that part of our constitutional responsibility, deciding what inferior officers should be vested, the appointment of which should be vested in the President alone or in heads of departments. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but there are really three major goals of this legislation. One is to stop the trivializing of the constitutional duty of advise and consent. We're advising and consenting on so many presidential nominations that the President isn't able to spend as much time as he should on getting them to us rapidly. It's slowing down the organization of government. We, in turn, are not able to spend as much time as we should reviewing the qualifications of the really important officers of the government that the President needs to appoint. And we're not serving ourselves well. We're trivializing the constitutional duty of advice and consent. Second thing we're doing, and the executive, the President, and the Congress are equally to blame, is we've created an environment that I would describe as being innocent until nominated, in which we take some self-respecting United States citizen, the President invites them to come take a position, in the federal government of position, in the federal government of honor and dignity, and suddenly they find themselves immersed in a series of duplicative interrogations from all directions in which they must fill out forms that define words like income in different ways, all of which seems designed to eventually lead them before a Senate committee, not to really assess their qualifications for the job, but to see if they can be trapped and turned into an apparent criminal. In other words, they're innocent until nominated. And every former administration's officials in recent memory has come to us and said we need to work together. Number one, to stop the trivializing of the Senate's advise and consent responsibility, and two, to do something about this syndrome of innocent until nominated. And finally, this legislation, which, as I said, has been moved to the floor with the consent of all 100 members of the Senate for debate, is really the third step in a discussion that began in January about what steps can we take to make the Senate a more effective place. One step was to get rid of secret holds. Another step was to limit the reading of the minutes as a dilatory tactic. And this is the third step, appointed by our two leaders, the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, the Republican Leader, Senator McConnell. They asked Senator Schumer and me to form a working group. Many senators have had input. Staff has worked hard. We now have come forward with a bill and a resolution which we'll debate today and tomorrow until we're finished, and it will streamline executive nominations and hopefully give us a chance to do more oversight on the positions that need the oversight and not waste our time with positions that don't. And at the same time, it'll make it easier for the next president to staff his or her government promptly so that they can deal with questions of war and the economy as they come up and not wait till 6 months or 9 months after they've taken office. And it will make it more inviting for good citizens of this country to accept a president's invitation to come serve in the federal government. As I mentioned, this came about earlier this year when we were about to have a showdown over the filibuster. The Senator from Oregon was a big part of that discussion and debate, and I hope he feels some credit for moving this discussion to where it is today. This is not all that the Senator from Oregon or the Senator from New Mexico or others wanted, but I think what we quickly learned in the Senate is a few small steps in the right direction are one good way to get where you want to go. And we've taken a couple, and this would be a third. Basically, this is what we'll be doing. We're affecting about 450 presidential appointments. This represents about 1/3 of all the Senate-confirmed positions. That sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But let me qualify it in this way. Here's what has happened over the last several years. President Kennedy, in 1960, had to fill 286 positions in the ranks of secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretary, assistant secretary, and administrator. By the time President Clinton came into office, there were 914 positions with those titles. That's according to the Volcker Commission report, which recommended the kind of changes that we're taking today. Since then, the Congressional Research Service has counted more than 1,200 presidential appointments requiring the advice and consent of the Senate. Our staffs on the Rules Committee and the Homeland Security Committee have found more than 1,400. So we're in the embarrassing position of having to answer the question if somebody were to say, here's this enormously important position of the Senate, this constitutional duty to advise and consent, how many presidential appointments are subject to advise and consent? The answer would be, we don't know. The Congressional Research Service says 1,200. Our staff say 1,410. And another indication that we're not giving them the sufficient attention we should, at least the ones we should, is the number of roll call votes on presidential appointments requiring advice and consent. You would think that if a presidential appointment were important enough to require a full FBI check, which is very expensive and very time-consuming, takes several months, and then a nomination by the president and all the vetting that goes with that, and then the work of the White House Personnel Office and all the time that's spent with that, and then it comes to the Senate and goes to our committees, and our committee has its own questionnaire and its own investigator and its own schedule for hearings and its own schedule for voting, and then it reports it to the floor. You'd think if it were important enough to go through all of that in order to get our advice and consent, that we'd take time to vote on it, would you not? Well, in the last Congress, this Senate voted on 3% of the nominations that require advice and consent. That's one indication that we're doing too many. We're trivializing the duty. So not only do we not know how many there are, we think now there are about 410, now that our staffs have worked through this, 1,410. Not only do we not know how many there are, 97% of them aren't important enough to vote on. We just pass them by unanimous consent. And as Senator Enzi said earlier today in another setting, and I don't think he minds my bringing this up, sometimes we approve these nominations in blocks, 280 of them at a time, as the Senator said, without knowing anything about them. So we are pretending that we're giving advice and consent when we're not. An example of that would be the positions that are several thousand members of the Public Health Service Officer Corps and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Officer Corps. They're all subject to advice and consent. These come through in the box loads. These are all very valuable public servants, I'm sure. But to subject the Public Health Service Officer Corps and the National Oceanic Administration Officer Corps to a full Senate advice and consent would be the approximate equivalent of requiring advice and consent of agricultural extension officers or forest rangers or members of the United States Senate staff. They all have important jobs, but they're not supposed to rise to the level of advice and consent, which is why the United States Constitution specifically said that we should select inferior officers, in its words, inferior officers whom the President himself, the President alone, or heads of departments may appoint. Now, what is an inferior officer? Well, words have meaning, and Justice Scalia gave a definition to the word inferior, when inferior officer in the case of Edmund versus the United States, which was in 1997. Justice Scalia said, "We think it is evident," said the justice, "that inferior officers are officers whose work is directed and supervised at some level by others who were appointed by the presidential nomination with the advice and consent of the Senate." That makes pretty good sense. That if you're working for someone who is appointed by the President and subject to advice and consent of the Senate, then you are accountable to the Senate and to the people of the United States through your superior. That makes you an inferior officer. You may be an important officer, but you're subordinate to someone else whose appointment was subject to advice and consent. Now, here is what we have done in the legislation. First, we have a bill, and then we have, that's from the Homeland Security Committee, and then we have a resolution which comes from our Rules Committee. Of the 451 positions that are affected, in addition to the thousands of members of the Officer Corps that I mentioned, of the 451 that are affected, 248 are part-time boards and commission positions that could be expedited and will keep their advice and consent roles and remain Senate confirmed. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then 118 other part-time board and commission positions will no longer require Senate confirmation. And then 85 positions that are full-time wouldn't require advice and confirmation. After all is said and done, when you include the fact that 248 of the positions we affected are merely expedited, they're still subject to advice and consent if a single United States senator says that it's necessary. Well, they're still subject to advice and consent under any event, and to the full treatment, to the full investigation if a single senator says that it's necessary. We'll still have more than 1,200 Senate-confirmed executive branch nominations. So as Senator Collins said on the floor today, after this is done, if our bill and resolution are passed, more than 90% of the full-time positions that now are subject to advise and consent will still be subject to advise and consent, and more than 85% of the part-time positions. Now, why is it important that we have so many positions that are subject to advice and consent? One could argue that why don't you narrow it simply to the cabinet members or to the cabinet members and their deputies? Why slow the president down in his work by requiring so many to come over? Because even after we're through with this, even if everything that Senator Schumer and I and Collins and Lieberman have recommended to the Senate were adopted, the Senate will have 1,200 persons that could put through this gauntlet of advise and consent confirmation and make its point. And many senators choose to use these confirmation proceedings to exercise our prerogative as elected members of Congress to get information or to assert our views or to influence the direction of government. For example, Senator McConnell has been holding President Obama's trade nominees until President Obama sends his free trade agreements to Congress. Senator Grassley and Senator Chambliss held up the Solicitor General's nomination because it had been 2 years and their requests for documents from the Department of Justice had not been forthcoming. After they held up the Solicitor General's nomination in the advise and consent process, they got their documents. But I would suggest that having 1,200 opportunities to hold a presidential nominee hostage is enough for any senator to work his or her will in order to make a point, and that to go beyond that is to begin to trivialize the whole process. As I mentioned earlier, our legislation has two parts. In the first part, the part we're debating now, the bill, there are approximately 200 positions that now are subject to presidential confirmation that would not be subject to presidential confirmation. And these would be 85 full-time positions, including legislative affairs and public affairs positions, chief financial officers, information technology positions, and others. These are all important positions. But let's think of it this way. I was once a cabinet member, and it took me about 3 months, 4 or 5, from December to March after I was announced to be confirmed by the Senate. And then I had the opportunity to ask the President to send to the Senate all of the subordinate officials who required Senate confirmation. That means the President had to vet those people. That means the Senate had to go through its whole process once information got here and vet those people. It had to schedule a hearing. It had to report out the name. That had to come to the Senate. That had to be voted on the floor. So there I was sitting, confirmed in March or April, after I had been announced in December as the President's Education Secretary. But it took me until toward the end of the year to get most of the President's team in place in the Department of Education. Now, who does that serve? Who does that serve well? Wouldn't it be better if I could appoint my own legislative affairs officer who could then come up and deal with Congress from April on instead of having to wait until later? And this is important for citizens to know. If you're in a position subject to advise and consent, you're not to go to the department until you're confirmed, or you won't be confirmed, because it would be considered to be an insult to the Senate. So you have cabinet members, particularly at the beginning of an administration, sitting there almost alone without any new members of the President's team to help them implement policy. And that affects the voters in a bad way. Let's say all the voters in the country get upset with President Obama and elect a Republican president whose job it is to bring the deficit down. Let's just pose a hypothetical. Yet, in comes the new Republican president, and it takes 2 or 3 months to confirm the Secretary of the Treasurer, the Office of Management and Budget, and then other key people, it might take 6 or 8 months. And the people of this country are saying, wait, I voted in November, and the government, here we are in the next summer, and the government still isn't formed, and the deficit's still bad. I'm very frustrated with my government. This is legislation that's set to deal with that. So the first position, the bill itself takes some positions and about 200 and removes advise and consent. 118 of those are part-time advisory commission members. Then the second part of the bill that we'll be discussing takes 248 nominations and expedites them. Now, these are all part-time. This might be the Goldwater Scholarship Foundation or the National Council on the Arts. And what it does is create a new procedure here in the Senate, and the President's nomination simply comes to the desk. The President's already vetted this person. The person has to answer the questions of the relevant committee in the Senate. But unless some senator objects, once that's done, the vote can come to the floor within 10 days. Yet if one senator objects, all 248 of those nominations can go through the full process. So with those, we at least believe we're speeding things up. So to summarize, for 451 nominations in this bill, we take about 118 part-time positions and remove them from advice and consent. These include, for example, 20 members of the National Board of Education Services, 20 members of the National Museum and Library Service Board, 15 members of the National Board of Education Sciences, 7 commissioners of the Mississippi River Corporation. Now, I'm sure the National Museum and Library Services Part-Time Advisory Board does good work for us and for this country. But is it really necessary for the Senate to spend its time on advise and consent of these part-time advisory members of the National Museum and Library Services Board when we ought to be reducing the debt, inquiring into the policies of a cabinet member, or working on some other legislation? And then in the resolution, 248 part-time positions are expedited. And as I mentioned earlier, nearly 3,000 members of the Officer Corps Public Health Service are taken out of advise and consent. Let me speak, Mr. President, for just a moment about the other part of the legislation. I've talked about how the bill and the resolution will take 451 of approximately 1,410 presidential nominees subject to advise and consent, and take about half of those and expedite them, and take the other half and take away the advise and consent requirement, leaving 1,200 persons whose nomination actually requires advise and consent. Well, what happens to those persons? Let me give you an example. And it's a personal example that I've repeated on the Senate floor before. In December of 1990, President Bush announced in the White House that he was going to nominate me to be the United States Education Secretary. I was excited about that. I was then the president of the University of Tennessee. I packed up sold my house. My wife and I packed up. We moved our children to schools in Washington, and I came up here prepared to serve and help the president be the education president. I forgot about Senate confirmation. Now, I should have known because I used to work in the Senate years ago, but I forgot about the Senate confirmation in all of its splendor. So when I got up here, I was, after a while, summoned before the Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee, on which I now serve. And with my family sitting there, the senator from Ohio, the late Senator Metzenbaum, said, well, Senator Alexander, I've heard some very disturbing things about you, Governor Alexander, he called me, but I don't think I'll bring them up here. Well, Senator Kassenbaum from Kansas turned around and said, well, Howard, she said, you just did bring it up. Why don't you go ahead and talk about it? I said, Senator, if you heard any disturbing things, I'd like to know about them because I'd like to answer the questions. But he decided not to do that, and in his wisdom, and was his right, Senator Metzenbaum held my nomination up for 3.5 months. I didn't know what to do about that, so I went around and finally saw Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire. And I told him the story of what had happened. I said, what's your advice? He said, keep your mouth shut. You've got no cards to play. I said, what do you mean? He said, let me tell you my story. He said, President Ford nominated me, Senator Warren Rudman, to be on, I think it was the Federal Trade Commission in the 1970s. And Warren Rudman was then the Attorney General of New Hampshire, a well-respected citizen. The senator from New Hampshire put a secret hold on Warren Rudman's nomination. And so days and weeks went by and no action in the Senate on the Attorney General of New Hampshire. He was greatly embarrassed by the whole thing. And I said, well, what did you finally do? And he said, well, I asked the president to withdraw my name. I said, is that the end of the story? He said, no. Then I ran against the so-and-so in the next election and beat him, and that's how I got in the United States Senate. Well, not every citizen can run for the United States Senate and defeat the senator who they think doesn't treat them fairly in the confirmation process. But there is a lot about the confirmation process that can be fixed and still leave all of us with the right to hold up, vote against, defeat 1,200 different nominations by the president. Take, for example, what happened in President Obama's first year. According to news accounts, we were in March of 2009. There were key vacant positions at the Treasury Department, an Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax, Trade, and Tariff Policy, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Tax Affairs. The first choice for Deputy Secretary of the Treasury withdrew her name from consideration 4 months after the president's election and the biggest economic crisis we'd had since the Great Depression. According to one news source, the list of vacancies on the Treasury Department website, quote, showed, quote, Main Treasury building is a lonely place, conjuring up visions of Geithner signing dollar bills one by one, watering the plants, and answering the phones when he's not crafting a bank rescue plan. Of course, there are other career employees available, and there was at least one holdover assistant secretary, and there are various czars in the White House. This kind of delay actually encourages the unhealthy appointment of czars in the White House because the president can just do that. But even one of the czars expressed concern about the slow filling up of the Treasury Department. And of course, whether you're a Republican or Democrat and voted for President Obama or not, you certainly didn't want a president whose Treasury Secretary wasn't equipped to deal with the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Now, the president brought some of this difficulty on himself, and our legislation recognizes that. Not just this president, but previous presidents and the next president. Part of the president's difficulty in filling jobs, and this is one that has afflicted every president since Watergate, is the maze of investigations and forms that prospective senior officials must complete and the risk they run that they'll be trapped and humiliated and disqualified by an unintentional and harmless mistake. Now, I voted against Secretary Geithner's nomination because I thought it was a bad example for the man in charge of collecting taxes not to have paid them, and I didn't think his excuse for not paying them was plausible. But that doesn't mean I think that every minor tax discrepancy in our Byzantine tax code that reaches 3.7 million words and is badly in need of reform should disqualify any citizen for public office. I think very few Americans with complex tax reforms could make their way through our maze of investigations and come out without a single change in what they did. Take the case of the former mayor of Dallas, Ron Kirk. He was President Obama's nominee to be the U.S. Trade Representative. Headlines in the newspaper said Kirk paid back taxes. Why? Primarily because he'd failed to list his income and then take a charitable deduction on speaking fees that he gave away to charity. You say that again. He'd failed to list his income and then take a charitable deduction on speaking fees he gave away to charity. Now, common sense suggests that Mr. Kirk and his tax advisor did what was appropriate. After all, he didn't keep the money. The IRS apparently has a more convoluted rule for dealing with such things. In any event, the matter is so trivial as to be irrelevant to his suitability to be the trade nominee. I mean, tax audits are only the beginning. There's an FBI full field investigation. I mean, should we really be having FBI field investigations for part-time advisory board members on the Museum Library Corporation? Have paying these diligent FBI agents, instead of investigating terrorists or catching bank robbers, they're out asking your neighbors, does he or she live beyond his means, in order to serve on a part-time advisory board for the federal government. And then there are the federal financial disclosures. There's the White House questionnaire. And, of course, the questions from the confirming Senate committee. All these are different. And the definitions they ask for are different. And an unsuspecting nominee, as I mentioned earlier, might actually fill out a form that said, what is your income, in the same way each time, but the question might have been different each time. It's easy to make a mistake, and then when you finally appear before the confirming committee, you are innocent until nominated. Washington, D.C. has become the only place where you should hire a lawyer, an accountant, and an ethics officer before you find a house and put your child in school. The motto around here has become innocent until nominated. Every legal counsel since President Nixon of the White House agrees with what I've just said. In the name of effective government, this process ought to be changed. There's some limits on what we can do in the Senate. We have to respect the separation of powers. In the end, the President has to conduct his own vetting process, and in the end, the Senate must conduct its own investigations. But we might work together to look at possible ways of reducing burdens and delays in the appointment process, and that's what the Executive Branch Working Group provided for in our legislation says. It would be chaired by the Director of the Office of Presidential Personnel, and members would include representatives from the Office of Personnel Management, the Office of Government Ethics, the FBI, individuals appointed by the chair who have experience and expertise, individuals from other agencies, other individuals from previous administrations, and they would report to us in 90 days on a SMART form. A SMART form would simply be a single form that would make it possible for a nominee to answer duplicative vetting questions one time. Now, that makes pretty good common sense. Why can't the government do that? And it would submit those findings within 90 days to the President for his consideration and to our relevant Senate committees for our consideration. In addition, Senator Collins has asked the working group within the next 270 days to take a look at the background investigations. A big part of the delay in forming a government are the President's own background investigations. Now, we'd like to know if somebody used to be a member of al-Qaeda or has some other serious problem before they come into a government, but there are gradations of that. Whether you're Secretary of the Treasurer or a member of a part-time advisory board, might have a little different level of vetting, I would think. But in any event, Senator Collins would like the working group to report back to the President and to us the feasibility in appropriate circumstances of using non-FBI personnel to conduct background investigations for Senate-confirmed positions. So these will be simply reports, an effort between the Senate and the Executive to take a look at streamlining the process, both so that we can staff the government more quickly, so we can stop wasting so much time here in duplicative ways, so we can stop the expense of that wasted time, and so we can treat with respect the men and women that any president invites to become a member of the administration. Mr. President, since our bill was first drafted, we've made a number of changes in response to suggestions by our colleagues both on the Democratic and Republican side of the aisle. I suspect that's one reason why all 100 senators have agreed to allow this bill to come to the floor and to be debated with any relevant amendment, is because we're open to that. We've made some changes. For example, I mentioned the 248 expedited part-time appointments. The concern was that while there's a Democratic president, there's a requirement in the law that a minority of those appointees be Republican members of the part-time advisory board. Well, what if a Democratic president said, I'm going to appoint Republican members who I define as Republicans? We Republicans didn't like that very much. The Democrats wouldn't like it very much if they were on the other side of the fence in another administration. So the solution was this expedited process whereby we can send those 248 nominations through the Senate much more quickly. And if a single senator thinks that the president's playing games with minority nominations, he or she can insist that the nominee go through the whole advise and consent process. In fact, for any reason, a single senator can do that. Another change we've made is to say all relevant amendments are open for debate and for voting. And I'm hopeful that my colleagues will bring some of those to the floor this afternoon, and we'll begin to debate them, perhaps to vote on them today. If not vote on them today, start voting on them tomorrow. We've also agreed that Senator Dement, Senator Vitter, Senator Coburn each can offer a specific amendment. I know Senator Schumer has been meeting with Democratic senators, just as I've been meeting with Republican senators, to see if there are any other changes. We'll have the amendments. I may oppose them all, I may support them all, but at least we'll be doing what the Senate ought to do, which is bring them up. If they're good amendments and a majority of us agree, or 60 of us agree, then we'll change the bill and eventually we'll vote on it. Mr. President, Senator Collins earlier, I have just one more thing I'd like to say. Senator Collins earlier mentioned the amount of support that we've gotten from outside groups who've worked on this, and especially from those who once served in the Senate or once served in the White House in positions that have to do with personnel. My work with the White House goes back a long time. I was a young staff aide in the Nixon administration, and I was a cabinet member in the first Bush administration. So I know a lot of the men and women who've been the general counsels to presidents, who've been the personnel directors, who've watched the process closely. I think it was Boyden Gray, who was counsel of the first President Bush, who gave me the phrase innocent until nominated. But every single one of those men and women, I don't know one without exception, who doesn't think this system is broken, who doesn't think we're trivializing the advice and consent process of the Senate, who doesn't think that we're doing a great disservice to our country and to individuals when we allow this innocent until nominated syndrome to persevere. And they've watched over the last 10 years as very good senators have tried to change this without success. I mean, Senator Reid and Senator McConnell, when they were whips, tried to do it. They didn't succeed. Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins tried a few years ago. They didn't succeed. Senator Thompson tried to do it when he was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and he got a few changes made, but not very many. And it's only this year, in response to our general discussion about how to make the Senate a more effective place, and because of the strong support of Senator Reid and Senator McConnell, and because of the battle scars that Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins have, having tried before, and their willingness to try again, that we've gotten to this place. I think we'll get to where we need to go. But I want to make sure that in this debate that we don't succumb to the desire to say, oh, well, my committee would like to have this person in advise and consent just for the prestige of it. I think it's much more important for a new cabinet member to have an appointee who can serve the president, serve the country, and do his or her job. And then let the secretary and the deputy secretary and the undersecretary be the ones who are accountable to the president. At least that's the recommendation of former Senator Fred Thompson, who was chairman of the Committee on Governmental Affairs. That's the recommendation of a task force formed by the Aston Institute, which included Senator Bill Frist, our former majority leader, Chuck Robb, a Democratic senator, Clay Johnson, who was George W. Bush's Director of Presidential Personnel, Mac McClarty, who was the White House Chief of Staff for Bill Clinton. They all said this urgently needs to be done. Frank Carlucci, the former Secretary of Defense, weighed in with his support. The Bipartisan Policy Center, including former Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman, a Democrat, and Trent Lott, our former whip and majority leader, and Pete Domenici, our former senator, Dirk Kempthorne, former governor, cabinet member, and senator. They all urged us to do this. Senator Collins asked that all these letters of support be placed in the record, and so I won't ask that they be added at this point. But I'd simply conclude by saying that there has been a little information around that somehow this is legislation to reduce oversight. This is legislation to make oversight more effective. If we were to propose using advise and consent for every Senate staff member, for every agricultural extension service member, and from every forest ranger, that would be less oversight because they wouldn't have time to do anything. That, in effect, is what we're doing now with advise and consent by the bucket load of officer corps members and of advisory commission part-time members who the president can vet and appoint, and all of whom report to somebody whom we do have advise and consent control over. So I look forward to this discussion and this debate, and I'm very grateful to my Republican colleagues, some of whom have questions about the bill, who have allowed this bill to come forward in the way the Senate should operate. Senators can bring their relevant amendments to the floor as long as they and the parliamentarian agree that it's relevant. They can call it up. We'll debate on it. We'll either vote on it then or we'll set a time for a vote in the near future. I expect there to be several amendments. I would urge senators to come to the floor and hope at the end of the day that we complete these modest but important steps toward making the Senate more effective by reducing the trivializing of advice and consent, our constitutional duty, and by reducing the syndrome that presidential nominees are innocent until nominated. Mr. President, I thank the chair. I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call up 3 amendments and speak on them at another time. So first, I would like to call up amendment number 501.
The clerk will report.
Senator from South Carolina, Mr. Dement, proposes an amendment numbered 501.
I ask the reading of the amendment be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to call up amendment number 510.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from South Carolina, Mr. Dement, proposes an amendment numbered 510.
President, I'd like the reading of this amendment to be suspended.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I'd like to call up amendment number 511.
The clerk will report.
Senator from South Carolina, Mr. Dement, proposes an amendment numbered 511.
Mr. President, I would ask the reading of this amendment be suspended.
Without objection.
And I thank you for the time. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
objection.